Hello, and welcome to the of your audiobooks. This is the complete story of everything I wrote and never said, every letter that I wrote, and everything Kian never said out loud, retold chapter by chapter as one continuous narrative, so nothing from either of their sides is left out. It's the story of a woman who kept a secret notebook for the man she loved, filling it with everything she was too afraid to say to his face, and the story of a man who loved her the whole time, in his own quiet language, without knowing she couldn't always hear it. Settle in. This one takes its time, the way real love does. Chapter 1, the first page. Longing. It begins with a notebook Thara bought for no reason she could explain to the shopkeeper, or to herself, only that one night, after Kian fell asleep with his phone still glowing on his chest and her dinner going cold beside him, she sat on the kitchen floor with 100 things to tell him and nowhere to put them. She called it a confession booth, a rehearsal room where she could practice being brave in small increments until she was ready to say the truth to his actual face. A few nights later she wrote about a stranger kind of longing, how she could miss him from 3 feet away, how a closed door in someone's eyes doesn't need distance to ache, and how she was learning that longing sometimes just needs a second knock instead of one. When he left for a work conference, she found herself missing the unglamorous, ordinary versions of him, the badly washed dishes and the inefficient chatter he never gave her on the phone, and admitted she'd been quietly collecting unspoken requests the way other people collect stamps. Then came the smallest, most ordinary proof of love she had. He moved a kitchen knife 2 inches out of her path without even looking up from his conversation, and she realized his love spoke in inches and quiet corrections instead of the big airport sentence she'd grown up expecting, and that she was learning to trust the evidence even without an audience to confirm she'd seen it. By her 5th letter she named the real ache underneath all of it, a locked room inside him she had knocked on gently for 2 years, always answered with a joke or a kiss instead of the truth, and she wrote that she wasn't impatient, only waiting, wanting to sit inside that fear with him instead of being kept outside its door. What she never knew was that Kian was carrying his own quiet version of those same evenings. He thought their silences were simply the good kind of rest 2 tired people had earned, never once imagining how loud that same silence sounded from her side of it, or that the reading light and her shoulder against his were, to him, already the whole of what he wanted from a night together. Chapter 2, Salt Water. Anxiety. Anxiety arrived next, and its first appearance was almost ordinary in how small it started. He was 2 hours late one evening, and she checked her phone 11 times, building 4 increasingly dramatic explanations in her head before he walked in with takeout and nothing more sinister than traffic, and she admitted, in the same breath as her relief, that the fear was never really about takeout at all. It traced back to a childhood afternoon when her mother was late and no one explained why, and she confessed that a much older kind of lateness was still being kept score of somewhere underneath the surface. She wrote about rereading his texts like a detective, turning over a single flat busy day, talked tonight as though its punctuation might reveal something, even while admitting there had never once been real evidence to find. On a heavy, formless afternoon she called him wanting only to be sat with, not solved, and noticed that his kindness kept arriving 1 beat too early, before she'd finished being human about the thing. Unable to sleep one night, chest tight for no nameable reason, she wrote about matching her breathing to his sleeping rhythm, using him as an anchor without his ever knowing it. And the night before his cousin's dinner, she rehearsed 6 versions of small talk in the shower, more frightened of performing certainty in front of an audience than of any question itself. Kian, for his part, had already begun noticing the pattern without a name for it yet, the way she went quiet before family calls and difficult evenings, and had quietly made it his own private maintenance to sit a little closer, refill her glass, rest a hand on the back of her neck, never once telling her he had been watching that closely all along. Chapter 3, The Mirror Doesn't Lie. Insecurity. Insecurity crept in around Valentine's Day, when a rushed apology and a lit candle left her sitting with a dinner that didn't match the version she'd built in her head, and she admitted, more honestly, that she had never actually told him what she wanted. She had simply expected him to know, the way people expect in stories. Soon after, an offhand mention of a sharp, capable coworker sent her lying awake measuring herself against a woman she'd met twice, and she was careful to name the feeling as her own insecurity's handwriting, not his. She confessed to crying easily at things he'd call small, to feeling like the weather in a relationship where he was the steady ground, and was quietly moved the night he handed her a tissue without teasing her, without even looking away from the screen. When her mother pressed about making things official, she didn't admit that she sometimes doubted whether she was doing any of this right, not because of him, but because she'd never seen a love worth modeling herself after, and was terrified of inventing a standard no one could actually meet. A small fight about a dishwasher cracked something open when his fixed didn't mean the same thing as her fixed, and she realized careful people build walls without meaning to. And in her final letter of the chapter, she traced the insecurity all the way back to her father, who stopped calling on the promised days when she was 11, and to a girlhood spent being told she was too much, a fear Kian had somehow inherited from a man he'd never met, without either of them knowing it. Across those same weeks, Kian was replaying their small fight in the car each morning, debugging himself line by line for a fault he couldn't find, quietly terrified that he could do everything correctly and still fail the one subject that came with no manual, a fear he had never told a single person, not even, almost, his own mother. Chapter 4, Losing You Quietly. Fear of losing. The fear of losing him showed up next, and she named it plainly, that one day she would finally be brave enough to tell him everything she felt, and it would be too much, and he would look at her the way he'd look at a spreadsheet that didn't balance, and decide, quietly and rationally, that she cost more than she was worth. She wrote about staying soft-spoken on purpose, keeping her biggest rooms locked because a locked room can't be the reason someone leaves. A dream one night showed him packing a bag without raising his voice, just tired and finished, and she woke reaching for his side of the bed, unsettled by how tidy even her subconscious had kept him while imagining him gone. She caught herself, another night, asking where he'd been twice in 2 different disguises, checking the temperature of his love like it might have quietly changed since morning, and set her phone face down on the table as a small experiment in restraint, lasting 11 minutes and writing the number down as proof that 11 was more than 0. She began to name the difference between fear's instructions and love's. Fear says hold tighter, love says tell the truth and trust it can hold, and noticed herself choosing calm once, deliberately, instead of the old vigilance. And in a harder conversation about calendars and actions, she almost said the truest sentence she had, I'm afraid you'll decide I'm too much to keep, and chose a smaller, safer one instead, regretting it afterward on the page. What she didn't know was that Kian ran his own quiet audit some nights after she'd fallen asleep. Was I present today? Did I say the thing instead of just doing it? Afraid, underneath the calm everyone relied on him for, that he loved her more than he knew how to prove, and that the gap between the two would be the reason she eventually left. He had never told anyone that fear. He was only just beginning to admit it to himself. Chapter 5, The Question I Don't Ask. Doubt. Doubt settled in as a quieter, harder question, not whether she loved him, but whether he was actually happy, or only steady, and she confessed she'd never asked directly because she was afraid of both possible answers. She doubted herself some nights more than she doubted him, wondering if the kind of love she wanted only existed in books, until a phone call with her friend Anjali left her turning over the line that wanting more isn't the same as wanting different. A sharp comment about a forgotten engagement, thrown out in a moment of hurt pride, left her composing an apology for days, testing sentences the way he'd test code before shipping it. Asked by a friend if she could see them married, she said yes instantly, and spent the evening realizing the doubt she carried was never about the destination, only about how to ask for the parts of the map she hadn't learned to read aloud yet. And by her 5th letter she arrived somewhere new. She didn't doubt him, or them, only the current shape of what they'd built, and pictured the two of them knocking out a wall neither of them had built on purpose but both had kept living inside of anyway. Kian, without being able to name why, had started noticing her watching him a beat longer after he spoke, as if waiting for a second sentence that never came, and had quietly begun adding an extra line here and there where he'd normally stop, not because he'd found the eloquence he assumed she wanted, but because he'd decided the attempt mattered more than getting it exactly right. Chapter 6, The Weight I Carry. Depression. Then came the weight that had no name, a heavy day, not sad about anything specific, just heavy the way a coat is heavy when you've worn it so long you forget it can come off, and she smiled through dinner while he either didn't notice or didn't know what to do with it. She tried to write the true shape of the feeling without softening it, a well-furnished room she wasn't allowed to leave, warm but doorless, where what she wanted wasn't to be let out but to be joined in. She described the strange, specific loneliness of being low beside someone who loved her, arm around her, and still carrying the weight alone in a room with company in it, suspecting that not a good enough reason had done more damage in her life than she'd accounted for. She felt guilty even naming the heaviness, aware he'd never given her a real reason for it, and reminded herself that feelings don't need a permission slip signed by someone worse off. Then something shifted, she admitted, out loud this time, that she'd been waiting for him to speak her language instead of learning his, and watched him go quiet in a way that finally read as someone taking her seriously instead of retreating. And in her final letter of the chapter she wrote down a small, hopeful fact: she had laughed, really laughed, at his terrible impression of his own boss, and for 10 whole minutes the weight simply wasn't there. Kian, meanwhile, had noticed her quietness without being able to place it on any map, and afraid of asking the question wrong, chose instead to pay closer attention. Thursdays, the shape of her shoulders when she thought he wasn't looking, telling himself he would try to ask properly soon, and each time losing his nerve at the last second. Chapter 7, Walls I Didn't Mean to Build. Communication. Slowly, the walls between them began to come down. He remembered, without her saying it twice, that Thursdays were hard, and made her tea without being asked, and she began to understand his small gestures as a full vocabulary of their own, complete without needing more syllables. One night she tried something new, saying the plain version instead of the polite one, telling him directly that she felt far from him when he rushed to fix things, and was startled when he thanked her for the honesty instead of flinching from it. Another night ended in a small misfire when she said she was fine out of old habit and he believed her out of his, and she promised the page she would interrupt that lie next time instead of letting the evening quietly miss him. She came to understand that he wasn't withholding his feelings, only translating them slowly through a language never built for speed, and began meeting him halfway down his own hallway, asking direct questions and wading through the silence instead of filling it herself. And in the chapter's last letter she described an evening of real, if imperfect, conversation, him reaching for a solution twice and putting it down both times when she asked him simply to sit with her instead, small and unglamorous and, to her, enormous. Kian, in this same stretch of weeks, had started rehearsing sentences before saying them, and had begun keeping a short list on his phone of phrases he wanted to remember to say more. I missed you today, tell me more about that, feeling a little ridiculous about the note, and using it anyway. Chapter 8, What I Choose to Believe. Trust. Trust, when it finally came, arrived quietly. After a silent dinner, she asked directly where he'd gone in his head instead of building a case in her mind, and for the first time she simply believed his answer, deciding that trust wasn't a feeling but a choice she kept making on the nights it would have been easier not to. She asked, plainly and without 3 apologies first, for something she needed, a check-in during long work weeks, and was stunned at how little it cost to ask, and how much unnecessary suffering the years of hinting instead might have cost her. In one letter she wrote everything she would say if her mouth worked the way the pen did, that she wanted a love that talked back to her at midnight, that she had never once written the word leave about herself in all these pages, and that every locked room in the notebook had been built by her alone, long before she'd met him. They finally talked through an old wound about a forgotten calendar, and she learned he had replayed that same fight almost as many times as she had, which changed, in a good way, how she pictured him carrying things. And in her last letter of the chapter she decided trust was smaller and more boring than anyone described it, a private tally, chosen 4 separate times in a single day, small currency that was, she was increasingly convinced, the actual foundation the whole house was built on. Kian, for his part, had quietly noticed the shift too, that she no longer asked him twice where he'd been, that she now waited, actually waited, for him to arrive at his own sentence, and found, to his own surprise, that being trusted like that made the words come faster, not slower, as though patience itself had finally taught him fluency. Chapter 9, Closer Than Words. Intimacy. Closeness arrived almost without announcement. On an ordinary night of nothing, him reading, her folding laundry, she felt something closer to peace than the familiar ache, and realized what had changed was her. She'd stopped measuring his love against a script she'd never shown him. She watched him fall asleep first one night, his hand loosely around hers, and stayed awake memorizing the unguarded softness that only ever showed itself in sleep. He told her, unprompted, about the year his parents almost separated when he was 11, and how he'd decided then to be steady rather than sorry, and she understood, finally, exactly what that locked door had always been guarding. She remembered the night 3 years earlier when he'd spilled a drink on her dress and knelt on the dance floor, unembarrassed, more worried about her than about the 20 relatives watching, and recognized it as the moment some early, unspoken part of her had decided he was safe enough to fall toward. She felt fully seen the day he remembered, unprompted, a small date about her grandmother she'd mentioned only once, months before, and understood that intimacy wasn't the big confession but being kept quietly in someone's memory. And in her final letter she promised herself she was finally ready to talk to him properly, not the sat-down kind, but the real kind, and that she no longer needed the notebook to hold the whole truth for her, because she was ready to carry it into the room herself. Kian, in these same weeks, had started saying the plain sentence first instead of last, "I missed you today," before the account of his meetings, not after, and had begun noticing, with something like wonder, how much lighter the evenings between them had gotten, without either of them resolving anything dramatic at all. Chapter 10, The Night He Found It. Discovery and Reconciliation. Then came the Tuesday that would not stay ordinary. Looking for a spare charger in her nightstand drawer, Kian's hand found the notebook instead, soft-cornered from months of being opened and closed in the dark. He almost didn't open it, he wanted that written down somewhere, even if only he would ever know it, but the first page was face up, and the first line he saw was "Dear my love," and something in him, the same something that noticed Thursdays and moved knives out of the way, told him this was not a stranger's diary. It was a door, left open. He read standing in the hallway for 11 minutes, and did not feel accused. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, fully seen. She had built him a room without knowing she was doing it, and had simply never let him inside. She found him sitting on the edge of the bed, the notebook closed in his lap, and knew instantly what had happened. "I wasn't looking for it," he told her. "I was looking for a charger." She crossed the room and sat beside him and asked him, gently, to say the part he was afraid to say, promising she would stay for it. "I didn't know I was making you feel like this," he finally said. "I thought handling things and loving you out loud were 2 different jobs, and I've mostly only been doing one of them." She told him she had never doubted that he loved her, only whether she was allowed to want more than that. He asked her, plainly, to teach him what the words were supposed to sound like, so he could practice them until they weren't foreign anymore, and then he said it himself, undefended, with no fix offered alongside it, "I love you, and I'm going to get better at saying so on ordinary Tuesdays, not just in the ways I already know how to show it." And she told him she was done needing a locked notebook to be brave in, that she was going to be brave in the room with him instead, starting now. By the following winter, Thora was still writing in the notebook, though everything about it had changed. Kian had laughed the first time he found out, then asked, quite seriously, if he was allowed to write in it too, and now there were pages in the back in his own handwriting, blunter than hers, funnier than she'd expected. They still argued. He still sometimes reached for the fix before he reached for her hand, and she still sometimes went quiet instead of asking for what she needed. They were not a finished story. But it had become, at last, a story written by both of them, out loud, in the same room, and in her final letter she wrote to him, simply, that she no longer had to imagine him reading her words. He already had. And he had stayed for every page. And that is the whole of it, every letter, both of their quiet, unspoken sides finally standing in the same room together. If you recognized any part of yourself in Lara tonight, the counting, the doubting, the locked rooms you built without meaning to, I hope you also recognized this: most love isn't loud. It's a knife moved 2 inches out of the way. A cup of tea made without being asked. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is finally saying the true sentence instead of the safe one. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stayed with you, follow the channel for more, and tell us in the comments which letter felt the most like your own.